Good evening, folks. We're going to talk about another interesting statistic. A statistic that happened 20 years ago with Ohio State. Where Ohio State won it all between a lot of things that really were pretty interesting. An entertaining challenge that happened 20 years ago. Now, this question is, is this year's Ohio State defense better than it was 20 years ago? You get the yardage, decide for yourself through each game. Versus the yardages allowed per each game, plus the quarterback numbers per each game. Plus the not quarterback yardages. Plus Krenzel versus Stroud. Let's do the numbers here. Well, obviously teams have also changed since then too, so it's obviously significantly different. I mean, if you wanted to say 20 years ago was like just yesterday, I mean, like I was still in high school. I was a senior in high school then. I would have graduated in 2003 and everything, so I was technically on my last stroll out of high school at that point. But if we want to compare the games, let's go game by game here. Right now, first game, 2002, Texas Tech, 45-21 Ohio State. 372 yards allowed to 477 total yards. 477 yards. Just like before when I did the 2022 season. Now, you look at Kent State. 51-17. 358 yards allowed to 412 yards. Then you get a decent Washington State team who pretty much played a pretty good games throughout its season. They beat 25-7. 280 yards allowed to their 363. Then Cincinnati. And they had a hard time with Cincinnati. Winning 23-19. With 415 total yards allowed. I mean, literally, Cincinnati had every opportunity to beat Ohio State in that game. And they failed to. Ohio State only had 292 total yards. And then they had Indiana. 45-17 win over Indiana. 339 yards allowed to 461. And then Northwestern happened. 27-16. That's 396 yards allowed to 455 yards. Then San Jose State. 50-7. 265 yards allowed to 567 yards. Then Wisconsin. 19-14. At Camp Randall Stadium. A hard place to win at. It was 340 yards allowed to 382 yards. Pretty close connection there. And then you have Penn State. 179 yards allowed to 253 yards. Pretty good game there. And then you have Minnesota. 34-3. 112 yards allowed to 322 yards. And then Purdue. 342 yards allowed to 267 yards. And that was a 10-6 win for the Buckeyes. And Purdue had every opportunity to win that game as well, but they failed to capitalize on a lot of faults that Ohio State had. Then you have the overtime game with Illinois. A 23-16 win for Ohio State in that game, with 358 yards allowed to 321 yards. That literally right there tells the story right there. In overtime. Then you have that team up north. Then Ohio State wins that game 14-9. Nothing but field goals were in that game. Same goes with Purdue, Minnesota. Pretty much those 3 games were nothing but field goals. There was 368 yards allowed to 264 yards. Now, then you have the national championship game. Miami, Florida, and Ohio State. It goes to double overtime, and Ohio State wins in double overtime. The most phenomenal upset in 2002. The shocker. The biggest shocker of all time in 2002, 2003 history. Ohio State 31, Miami, Florida 24. It was just 1 yard more than that team up north had, and we had only 3 more yards than what we had during the game against that team up north. I mean, it was literally just that much more. Now, I mean, this season's far from over. We yet to play that team up north and see what bowl game we're going to, or if we're going to the Big Ten Championship. I mean, there's a lot yet to be discovered on that part. And that team up north is a very talented team. They always have been a talented team when it comes to certain things. I mean, back then, and if you look at the numbers then, and Stroud versus, now we look at Stroud, the 2022 numbers. 250, the 21-10 win over Notre Dame, 253 yards allowed to 395. The 45-12 over Arkansas State, 276 yards allowed to 538 yards. The 77-21 win over Toledo, 307 yards allowed to 763 yards. More than literally every game there. And then you have Wisconsin, the 52-21 win over Wisconsin, 296 yards allowed to 593 yards. Then you got Rutgers, the 49-10 win over Rutgers, with 187 yards allowed to 413 yards. I mean, literally, these are like bigger numbers than what they have been. And then Michigan State, 202 yards allowed to 614 yards. And then you have Iowa, the 54-10 win over Iowa, 159 yards allowed to 360 yards. Then you got Penn State, which is a significantly better team than what they were then. 482 yards allowed to 452. Then Northwestern, 285 yards allowed, 283 yards. I mean, just a few difference. And then you have Indiana, 269 yards allowed to 662 yards. And then Maryland, 402 yards to 401. That's a pretty good game. That's a very good game. Now, when you play teams like this, you're literally looking down at the barrel of a double-barrel shotgun. Because Maryland didn't have a gun loaded. But they were ready to play. They just didn't have their guns loaded yet. Now, Michigan, on the other hand, they'll have their guns loaded. That team up north will definitely have their guns loaded. Because, now, don't get me wrong, they might have their struggles when it comes to certain things and everything. I mean, they will struggle on some occasions. I can see it happening. They will be struggling. But overall, I don't think they will. My final prediction score would be 28-17 Ohio State. I mean, I'm going to guess this would be a big, tough game between the two. Now, grant me if I'm wrong, I mean, when you play teams like Wisconsin, they were a pretty good team back then and now. I mean, same goes with, Penn State, they're pretty good then as they were now. There's some teams that have changed since then, but really not much. We didn't play Michigan State back then, and we didn't play Iowa then. Now, Purdue, on the other hand, that's going to be a toss-up. We don't know who will play in the Big Ten Championship if we beat Michigan. Or that team up north is what we call them. That team up north will be a interesting game. So, but they, however, went 12-2 on the regular season. So, with that being said, hit the like bell, hit the like button, hit the bell for notifications. And with that being said, I'm out of here. Peace.